A look through some of the Sunday papers. I'm joined now by the human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell, by the Conservative peer Baroness Neville Jones, who used to chair the Joint Intelligence Committee, and by the journalist Beth Gardner, who writes for the New York Times. Very good morning to you all. Let's dive in. Beth, we'll stay with you, and let's stay with something you know an awful lot about, the American election and Donald Trump. You've got two stories we'll roll together in the Times. Too wild, Trump for the West, and in the Observer he's going to sue some of his accusers, apparently. Take us through them. Yeah, well, this Trump too wild for the West story caught my eye because I think it really sums up where we are now in this campaign 2 weeks ahead of Election Day. Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, is in danger of losing Utah. Gloria Steinem, of all people, was campaigning there for Hillary Clinton a few days ago. This is just explain to the British public, you know, what a bombshell that would be.
Sure, absolutely, because Utah is a rock-ribbed conservative state, you know, easily won by any Republican nominee in the past. What we've been seeing happen over the last couple of weeks, since I think the turning point was the first debate, where the Donald Trump meltdown really began in the days following, and it's only gotten worse with the tape of him talking about sexually assaulting women and the various women who've come forward. He is now in danger of losing states that have been very reliably in the Republican column for many years, and Hillary Clinton is pushing hard because I think she's feeling pretty comfortable now with her 6 or 7 point lead, and she would really like to have a very decisive win, in part to quash some of these conspiracy theories that Trump has been putting forward. Just
to bring in our other reviews, I mean, Peter, do you think, though, some of the acrimony, and, you know, that's probably a polite way of putting it, that this campaign has generated, do you think some of that might linger, particularly with this Donald Trump line about, you know, well, I'll reserve judgment on whether I accept the result or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite scary because, of course, he has a lot of, some might say, quite wild followers, and who may know what they do if he loses. And one could easily imagine sort of the rise of extreme right-wing groups seeking to challenge the election result, not just in the courts, but in mass protests. And you know, some of these extremist groups are armed, and they have, some of them have made noises about not accepting the result.
Would you have concerns, Dame Pauline, if you know, was President Trump, and particularly about some of his foreign policy pronouncements, about his attitude towards Putin, about what he said he'd do to Syria and things?
No, some of them are pretty frightening. I mean, I suppose, like a lot of people, I hope that he's not going to win. But I don't think the populism that he represents is going to die. And I think that's one of the issues. And what's more, though I think the Senate may go Democrat, the House is unlikely to. So there's still going to be tension inside the system. So how much President Clinton's going to be able to do, I think, is another question.
Well,
I think the standoff in American politics may continue.
I think that's why you're seeing her now pushing so hard into the red states. It's partly about what Peter raised, this question of legitimacy and will there be...
Push it back.
Right, and it's partly about winning the Senate and maybe the House.
Yeah. What about, I want to move on to some other stories, but let's just, this threatening to sue some of the women who accused him, could be a dangerous strategy.
Well, this is, again, you know, an indication of what an unconventional candidate this is. 2 weeks before an election, any conventional candidate on either side of the divide, you would expect to be absolutely relentlessly on message at this point in the campaign. Trump went to Gettysburg, of all places. When you go to Gettysburg as an American politician, you are raising the bar as high as it gets. That's where Abraham Lincoln gave, you know, probably the greatest and most consequential political speech in American history. Trump went there and said, I'm going to sue all these liars after the election. You know, so this is not what the Republican Party wants to see him doing. They would like, even if victory is beyond his reach at this point, they would like to see him narrow the margin with Hillary Clinton because, as Dame Pauline just mentioned, what is now at stake is the Senate and the House, and the bigger the margin of victory is for Hillary Clinton, the harder it is going to be for the Republican candidates to overcome.
Baroness Neville Jones, bring in the battle for Mosul. I was discussing it with Roy Stewart a little bit earlier. It's not going to be easy, is it?
No, and I think it's not going to be a quick one either, and I think partly deliberately, because the Allied forces, so to speak, the Iraqis on the one hand, which were greatly helped by coalition forces, and also the Peshmerga, and they're doing a sort of pincer movement on Mosul. One of their big priorities is to reduce the level of civilian death. So they are taking it very carefully, and I think therefore fairly slowly. And the problem, I think, is it's not at all clear, whether this is going to turn out to be a set-piece battle with ISIS, or whether they will actually, in the end, escape. They will just disperse, having left behind the most terrible massacres. It's clearly already happening. That the civilian population is being used as human shields, being subjected to torture as well as oppression. It's a very, very nasty situation. So the consequences of Mosul, are big. First of all, you can get a dispersal of terrorists to other parts of the Middle East and possibly also returnees, Europe. And secondly, there is then the question of what kind of governance in that part of the world. By then, the one gain in all of this, political gain in all of this, is that ISIS will no longer really be able to claim a caliphate. It's reduced to an area around Raqqa. It's diminished. So that claim is undermined. But it's replaced, of course, by the huge problems of what kind of governance you put in place for this area, very mixed area of Sunni majority, but also lots of minorities, and also the Kurds. And that was one of the things, that destroyed Iraq first time round after the coalition left. So we cannot just leave them to their own devices. There has to be a proper follow-through.
We could discuss this thorny issue for the entirety of this paper review, but let's bring in some more stories. Peter, you've got this interesting one within the Times about universities likened to slave plantations.
Yeah, the Sunday Times did a very good story by Professor Andrews, the first black studies professor based at Birmingham City University. He has accused the university system of institutional racism on a par with the police. He's noted the fact that over 92% of British professors are white, that out of the 14,000 senior academic posts in British universities, only 60 are held by black men and women, and that when it comes to academic performance, black and ethnic minority students are much more likely to drop out of class and not get top-class degrees. So I think he's raised a really important issue. It's never
really been highlighted before, has it?
We think about universities.
Are astonishing.
We think about universities as liberal, enlightened places where equality and diversity rules, but quite clearly that is not the case.
Well, equality didn't reign for women until quite recently, and even now it doesn't. The top hamper is still largely male and largely white. Yeah. So this is a broad minorities issue still, I think. But point well taken.
I've got another story coming up from Beth, the Observer. 50 refugee girls arrive after a U-turn by officials, and this is what's going on with
I thought that was a very powerful story. We're awaiting now, obviously, the dismantling of this camp in Calais, and the fear that is, gripping people there, particularly the younger refugees, some of whom are minors and some of whom are on their own as they wait for their uncertain fate. This piece on the front of the Observer is looking at a group of, I think, 54 girls, refugees from Eritrea, who were the first now to enter this country under the Dubs Amendment, which was passed quite a few months now, I think, quite a few months ago now. There's also a lot of criticism in there from some of the aid agencies of the way the Home Office has handled this situation, whether it's a reluctance on an ideological basis or a security basis or a fear of political backlash to admit some of these refugees under the Dubs Amendment. There also seems to have been a real sort of cack-handedness just in terms of competence and making the wheels turn.
I want to get the views of you two about how you think the government's been handling this, and what do you put down? Beth calls it reluctance. What do you put that down to, Dame Pauline?
Well, I think, a number of things, including, I think, the sheer difficulty of sorting the children.
Sure.
And knowing what was what, and clearly that is a real issue. But I have to say that the Home Office has lost the public relations battle in this. From way back. They should have reacted much. We shouldn't have needed to have the Dubs Amendment. And having got the Dubs Amendment, they needed really to pull their finger out. And it would, one of the pieces of the story does seem to be that they didn't ask for help from people who could have helped them until relatively recently. And so now you face a...
What's really outrageous is that hundreds of these children have family in this country and are legally entitled to be here, but they're being kept in Calais for months and years. That's the real scandal. And
you think that's deliberate?
I think it's incompetence.
Deliberate.
No, I think it's incompetence.
And it's now having to be sorted in a matter literally of hours when there ought to have been months. I wonder if there's an element of distraction too, political distraction. Dubs was passed in May, wasn't it? And the Brexit vote happened in June. Well, the government's been busy with other things.
OK, a couple more stories. Peter, this one catches my eye that you've picked deep inside the Sunday Telegraph today, the last British hero of the anti-fascist war.
Stan Hilton has died at the age of 98. He volunteered to fight in the international brigades against Franco's fascists in the 1930s, and he has just sadly died. He's was the last living member of that international brigades. And what I think is, it's worth marking that heroic struggle against fascism. But it's also, I think, an interesting contrast between the attitude of the left then and the attitude of the left now. We don't see any left-wing solidarity with the people of Syria, with the Democrats, the left-wingers, the civil society activists in Syria, who are there in their hundreds of thousands. Everything is being portrayed as a struggle between Assad and the terrorists.
But you were on demonstration yesterday, weren't you?
I was,
You didn't see any of the Stop the War Coalition and others?
On that protest, to defend and support the civilian population of Aleppo, there was not a single left-wing or student banner. Years ago, the left and students stood in solidarity with civilians under attack, like that terrible, terrible bombing that's going on right now in Aleppo. I think I'm a left-winger, but not that kind of left. You know, I'm really depressed and saddened and angry that the left have deserted those Democrats within Syria who want a democratic state, and the people who, of course, began the whole episode with their peaceful protests in 2011, which Assad responded by massacring.
Boris Johnson says that kind of thing as well.
Well, good for him, but we need action. And I'd say to Boris Johnson, if he's really concerned, why isn't he pressing for an emergency special session of the United Nations General Assembly to mandate a UN no-bombing zone and civilian safe havens? The Security Council can be overridden by the General Assembly, so Russia cannot veto if there's a General Assembly vote. And that's what Boris Johnson and other leaders should be doing, going direct to the General Assembly, demanding a special session.
Okay. Our last story is the dimension of that, and you have it, Baroness Neville-Jones, Russia heading for a new Cold War. What do you mean heading for?
Well, if you look at, there's a very frightening statement by a Russian general. If we talk about the last Cold War, we are currently somewhere between the erection of the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, anybody is old enough to remember that, and I do, that's a very frightening statement. Now, I think that's an exaggeration. Nevertheless, the world is pretty tense. The problem of what you just said, Peter, is the Russians can't ignore a General Assembly resolution and simply not comply with a no-fly zone, which would create an extremely dangerous situation if they contested it. So I think we are, in Aleppo, this is the sort of sharp end of a much broader, I fear, mounting level of tension between Old East and West, whether it's in Ukraine, where the Russians don't really care about the future of Ukraine. What they really want to do is simply prevent Ukraine or coming into the Western orbit. And they'll wreck the country. They don't want a settlement, they just want to spoil it. There's a lot of trouble in the Baltic, there's a lot of trouble in the Baltic republics and in the Baltic Sea, violation of airspace and under submarine activity. We saw the Russian aircraft carrier come down the channel. This is all provocation, upping the ante. Why Putin does not have a successful economy at home? He needs to make clear the world is actually against Russia, and that's the problem.
Peter, I'll give you a few words.
I mean, you're absolutely right, and it underlies the way in which the Russian military has been restructured towards a long-range offensive capacity.
And they're now
very different from the past. It's copying the worst excesses of British and American imperialism.
And they're becoming politically dominant, and it's really worrying.
All right, Peter, Pauline, Beth, very good to see you all. Plenty to chew over with your muffins this morning, whatever you're having. You're watching Murnaghan on Sky News. Coming up.